Hello there, my YouTube family. Especially to my younger listeners, welcome back. I know many of you like to wind down with these stories, maybe even fall asleep while listening. So before we dive in, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and tell me where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now. Alright, take a deep breath, settle into your cozy blanket or pillow, and let's get comfortable. Tonight's story begins far away in the beautiful and bustling land of Australia, known for its beaches, its wildlife, and its strong economy. Australia also holds a darker history, one of deceit, greed, and a financial scandal that would leave thousands devastated. This is the story of Jonathan Jack Hollingsworth. Once admired as a financial genius, he would eventually be remembered as the man behind the largest financial fraud in Australian history. A bright beginning, Jack was born in 1965 in Sydney, into a normal middle-class family. His father was an accountant, his mother a school teacher. From a young age, Jack stood out not just for being smart, but for being sharp. He had a way with numbers and people. While other kids were playing outside, Jack was memorizing tax codes and reading balance sheets. His fascination with money was more than just curiosity, was ambition. By the time he reached university, he was already being called a prodigy. He studied finance at the University of Sydney, impressing professors and outperforming his peers. But even then, Jack didn't want to follow the rules. The rise of Hollingsworth Capital in the 1990s. Jack launched his own firm, Hollingsworth Capital. His pitch? Simple but bold. Double your money in just 3 years. He promised high returns, with no risk. People believed him, retirees, corporations, even charities. They gave him their savings, their trust, and in return, Jack gave them something that looked like magic. He wore sharp suits, gave inspiring speeches, bought mansions, private jets. He was even part owner of a sports team. The media adored him. Politicians praised him. Everyone wanted a piece of Jack Hollingsworth. But behind the scenes, it was all smoke and mirrors. The illusion of wealth, what Jack had really created, was a classic Ponzi scheme. He wasn't generating real profits. Instead, he took money from new investors to pay returns to old ones. His financial reports were completely fake, but so carefully crafted that no one questioned a thing as long as people kept investing. The illusion worked. The firm looked profitable. Jack looked untouchable. For more than a decade, Hollingsworth Capital thrived. Investors were lining up, and Jack's empire kept growing. But no lie lasts forever. The fall begins then. Came the 2008 global financial crisis. Suddenly, the markets were crashing. People wanted their money back. And for Jack, that was a problem, because there was no money, no real investments, no backup plan. He stalled. He lied. He tried one final gamble, risking everything in one huge market trade, hoping to win it all back. But the market wasn't kind. The plan failed. And just like that, his empire crumbled. The truth uncovered when investigators stepped in. They were stunned. Jack had defrauded investors of over 4.8 billion Australian dollars, the largest financial fraud in the nation's history. His properties were seized, his accounts frozen. He was arrested trying to flee on a private jet bound for the Caribbean. The courtroom was packed during his trial. Elderly people, families, small business owners, people who had lost everything. They came seeking answers and justice. The evidence was overwhelming. Faked documents, false prophets, lies upon lies. In the end, Jack Hollingsworth was sentenced to 42 years in prison, the harshest penalty ever given for a financial crime in Australia. A lesson in greed. Jack's story didn't start with crime. It started with ambition. But somewhere along the way, that ambition turned to greed, and that greed hurt thousands of innocent people. He had built his life on illusion, and when the truth caught up to him, it all vanished. The yachts, the fame, the respect, gone. His name, once admired, now serves as a warning about the dangers of blind trust, about chasing success at any cost, and about the devastating consequences of deception. Hello, again, my wonderful YouTube audience. To my teens, night owls, and those who like to fall asleep to these stories, you're in the right place. Before we begin tonight's case, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now find a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let your mind settle, because tonight's story is a powerful reminder of how even the brightest stars can fall hard. Case 1. The Collapse of Jack Hollingsworth. By October 2008, whispers of trouble began circling around one of Australia's most trusted investment firms, Hollingsworth Capital. Clients were reporting missing funds, auditors were uncovering suspicious discrepancies, and investigative journalists started asking uncomfortable questions. At the center of it all was Jonathan Jack Hollingsworth, the man once hailed as a financial genius. He tried to hold the illusion together, giving confident interviews, reassuring investors, and scrambling to secure last-minute deals with international banks. But the truth, it was already unraveling. December 3, 2008. The empire falls on December 3rd. Everything crashed down. The Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC, froze all assets tied to Hollingsworth Capital. Law enforcement raided the company's Sydney headquarters. Shocked employees watched as armed officers confiscated computers, bank records, and private files. From wealthy executives to everyday Australians, thousands suddenly realized they had been robbed. But Jack wasn't ready to face justice. While authorities built their case, he quietly liquidated what remained and prepared to flee to the Caribbean, where he had offshore accounts, a luxury mansion under a false name, and a new life waiting. He almost got away. December 7, 2008. The arrest just hours before takeoff. Jack was arrested at Sydney Kingsford Smith Airport. His private jet never left the runway. The man behind Australia's largest financial fraud, who had once been cheered by boardrooms and billionaires, now sat in handcuffs, powerless and exposed. The trial of the century. Jack's trial was one of the most watched in Australian legal history. The courtroom overflowed with victims, many of them elderly retirees who had lost everything. Prosecutors painted a damning portrait. A man who knowingly stole $4.8 billion OD, built his fortune on lies, and devastated thousands of lives. Witnesses described fake profits, forged documents, and elaborate deceit. The defense argued Jack had believed in his system, that he'd always intended to pay everyone back. But the truth was too clear. The evidence, too overwhelming. In 2010, Jack Hollingsworth was sentenced to 42 years in prison, the harshest sentence ever handed down for a financial crime in Australia. The damage left behind. Authorities auctioned Jack's luxury homes. His secret offshore accounts were drained. Over $1.3 billion AUD was recovered and distributed back to victims. But the damage could never fully be undone. The human cost for thousands. This wasn't just about money, it was about lost futures and shattered faith. Margaret and Harold Whitmore, a retired couple from Perth, had worked modest jobs and saved carefully for over 40 years. They invested their entire retirement $780,000 AUD into Hollingsworth Capital, believing it was a secure legacy. Instead, they lost everything. They were forced to sell their home and move in with their son. Margaret, once cheerful and full of life, became quiet and withdrawn. Harold spiraled into depression, unable to forgive himself for Jack. Then there was Daniel Thompson, a 35-year-old tech entrepreneur from Melbourne. After years of hard work, Daniel invested $2.4 million AUD into Jack's firm to expand his business. Globally, when the scandal broke, Daniel lost it all: his company, his employees, his marriage. He now lives in a one-bedroom apartment, working odd jobs just to stay afloat. And Samantha Reeves, a single mother from Brisbane. She had saved for years to pay for her daughter's university education. Hoping to grow her savings, she trusted Hollingsworth Capital with every cent. It vanished overnight. Her daughter had to abandon her dream of studying abroad. Samantha worked double shifts to make ends meet, haunted by the memory of the man who promised security but delivered only ruin. Jack in prison. Jack was placed in Silverwater Correctional Complex, one of the country's most secure prisons. First, he carried himself with the same arrogance that had once won over the elite. But prison has no interest in past glories. The guards didn't care who he'd been. The inmates weren't impressed with private jets or stock portfolios. To them, Jack was just another con man. Within his first year, he was assaulted twice. One beating came after an argument over food. The second, more brutal, was by an inmate whose mother had lost her life savings in Jack's scheme. That incident left Jack in the infirmary for weeks. His power meant nothing here. By year 3, the media had moved on. But inside prison, Jack had aged rapidly. His once thick hair had turned gray. His frame had weakened. He spent his days reading. Not for pleasure, but to escape the crushing monotony of his cell. He reflected often, but not with remorse. Jack didn't mourn for his victims. He mourned the empire he lost. A legacy of distrust even years later. The effects of Jack's fraud rippled across Australia. Financial regulations were rewritten. Investment firms came under tighter scrutiny. Institutions that once praised Jack turned their backs completely. But despite recovering over $1.3 billion AUD, the gap remained wide. $4.8 billion odd had vanished, and with it, trust. Trust in systems, trust in advisors. For some, even trust in themselves. The final echoes of Jack Hollingsworth, years after Jack Hollingsworth was locked away, the consequences of his actions continued to echo across Australia. By the time the dust settled, most victims recovered only a fraction of what they'd lost. The Australian dollar had shifted. Investments were wiped out. Futures were gone. Jack's name became synonymous with greed and betrayal. Universities dissected his downfall in ethics classes. Analysts studied his tactics. His story became a warning, whispered in every corner of the finance world. Never trust anyone who guarantees wealth. In 2021, over a decade into his prison term, a major documentary series aired, chronicling Jack's rise and collapse. It featured interviews with former employees, devastated clients, and financial experts. Jack was invited to speak, but he declined. He didn't want the world to see what he had become by 2025. The name Jack Hollingsworth had faded from headlines. His empire long dismantled. His identity erased from the upper echelons of finance. He was now just another aging inmate. Another case study in the long, painful legacy of financial fraud. Inside his prison cell, the world became very small, reduced to concrete walls, head counts, and the echo of slamming doors. For all his charm, for all the billions he once commanded, Jack now had nothing, not even his freedom. Case 2. Michael Thornton, the illusionist of Sydney Hour. Second story takes us deep into the heart of Sydney's financial district, where skyscrapers shimmered under the golden Australian sun. There, a man named Michael Thornton was building what appeared to be a financial empire. But behind the marble floors and glass walls was not a visionary, not a politician, or a tech genius. Michael Thornton was an illusionist whose magic didn't involve smoke and mirrors. His tools were numbers, charm, and carefully crafted lies. The rise of Thornton Global Investments. Michael was born in 1968 in a middle-class Melbourne household. His father worked in banking. His mother taught in public schools. From a young age, Michael didn't just dream of being rich, he wanted control over wealth. He wanted to pull the strings, not just hold the coins. By the age of 21, Michael had launched a modest financial consultancy. It was unassuming, but effective. He promised clients high returns, with little risk, and slowly. The word spread. By 1999, Michael Thornton was a rising star. His firm, Thornton Global Investments, was hailed as a revolutionary force. He was invited to speak at economic conferences. He appeared on national television. Politicians shook his hand. CEOs listened to him speak. To the public, Michael had cracked the code to effortless wealth. But behind the scenes, Thornton Global was a lie from the very beginning. The master of illusion, Michael, never intended to run a legitimate business. He knew what people wanted: wealth without risk, security without effort. And he gave them that illusion perfectly. Instead of investing client funds into stocks or ventures, he funneled the money into personal offshore accounts, luxury assets, and a lavish lifestyle. It was a classic Ponzi scheme. He used new investments to pay earlier clients, maintaining the illusion of success. As long as the money kept flowing, the game went on. By 2005, Thornton Global claimed to manage over $7 billion AUD. Its client list included everyday retirees, multinational corporations, and even government pension funds. But Michael wanted more. More power, more control, more admiration. The cracks began to show some. Financial experts began raising red flags. Thornton Global's reported returns seemed too good to be true. No losses, only growth. But Michael knew how to play the game. He didn't hide from the criticism. He embraced it. He gave confident interviews, claiming his critics were jealous of his success. He held luxury investor retreats in the Whitsundays and Gold Coast. He expanded offices to Melbourne, London, and Hong Kong, each a dazzling display of wealth. Marble floors, custom furniture, art-filled lobbies. Even the employees were trained to speak with confidence, offering false reassurance, backed by forged reports and fake portfolio updates. Behind the luxury, though, the truth was eroding. 2007-2008, the tipping point. By 2007, Michael Thornton had nearly 40,000 investors spread across Australia, New Zealand, and Asia. The money coming in had to be managed carefully to keep up the illusion. Confidence was the fuel, and Michael knew how to manufacture it. But then came 2008. The global financial crisis hit with brutal force. Stocks crashed. Banks froze loans. Investors worldwide began demanding their money back. Thornton Global Investments had no real financial backing. There were no reserves, no safeguards. And suddenly, Michael Thornton was afraid. The collapse of confidence as investors demanded answers. Michael scrambled. He forged new reports, claiming Thornton Global was thriving thanks to secret strategies and alternative assets. For a short time, it worked, but the math was breaking. Michael had spent hundreds of millions on yachts, private jets, and luxury properties from Sydney to the Bahamas. There was nothing left to cycle. Then came the moment of reckoning. A wealthy mining magnate from Perth, who had invested nearly $20 million OD, filed a lawsuit. He suspected fraud. The media caught wind. Regulators opened a probe, and the carefully built illusion began to fall apart. Welcome back to another quiet night. Another whispered tale from the shadows of high society. If you're already tucked in, lights dimmed, and eyes heavy, you're in the perfect place. And if you're new, you're welcome. You found a safe little corner of the internet where we tell the stories that history tried to bury. Tonight, we return to the unraveling of one man's carefully built empire. A man once praised as a financial visionary, who ended up becoming the architect of one of Australia's greatest financial betrayals. This is the quiet downfall of Michael Thornton. The illusion starts to crumble. It began with a simple request. One of Michael's longtime investors wanted to withdraw a large sum of money Nothing unusual at first, but for some reason the withdrawal kept getting delayed. That delay set off a chain reaction. The investors' lawyers started digging, combing, through Thornton Global's financial records. What they found was terrifying. Fake numbers, contradictions. Nothing added up, and just like that, the man once called untouchable was now running out of time. Michael Thornton was staring into the abyss. The last illusions. By early 2009, the pressure had become unbearable. Lawsuits were pouring in. Regulators were starting to ask questions. Journalists were poking around. And behind the glass doors of Thornton Global Investments, panic had replaced prestige. Michael tried to buy more time. He started liquidating assets, selling off properties, draining offshore accounts, doing anything to keep key investors paid and quiet. These weren't just any investors. They were politicians, powerful media moguls, and wealthy business executives, people who had the power to protect him or destroy him. So Michael paid them first. But the math didn't work anymore. For every $1 million he paid to silence one powerful person, 10 more investors were demanding their money back. Thornton Global had taken in over 7 billion Australian dollars, but by then, less than 100 million was left, and most of it was just numbers on a screen. The Great Escape Plan. Michael knew it was over. So, he did what desperate men do. He ran, using a maze of shell companies, anonymous trusts, and fake identities. He quietly moved the last of his funds, almost $70 million, secret accounts, in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Then, he booked a private jet to Dubai, a country with no extradition treaty with Australia. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: disappear among the ultra-wealthy, live under a new name, spend the rest of his life enjoying the money he stole. It was supposed to be foolproof. But what Michael didn't know was that he'd already been caught. The airport sting behind the scenes. Regulators and international law enforcement had been watching for months. They had tracked every wire transfer, every offshore account, and every forged document. And on the night of March 17, 2009, as his jet sat quietly on the tarmac at Sydney's Kingsford Smith Airport, moments from takeoff, the trap was sprung. Police vehicles, federal agents, and financial crime experts surrounded the plane. Armed officers stormed the jet. Michael was arrested in front of his pilots. His escape was over before it began. Flashing cameras lit up the night. By morning, every newspaper in Australia was calling him what he truly was: the phantom financier, the mastermind behind Australia's largest Ponzi scheme. The collapse of an empire. Within days of his arrest, Thornton Global Investments was declared insolvent, gone, finished. Thousands of investors lost everything: retirees, single parents, corporations, even government. Funds were hit. Over $6.8 billion had vanished, and most of it was impossible to trace. The trial of the century. Michael's trial was swift but unforgettable. The courtrooms were packed. Victims wept as they told their stories. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was emotional. It was personal. Michael was convicted of multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and financial deception. He was sentenced to 165 years in prison, the longest sentence ever handed down for a white-collar crime in Australian legal history. The media called it a reckoning. But to the thousands left penniless, it was too little, too late. Echoes of deception. As the investigation expanded, the truth got even darker. Michael hadn't just fooled everyday people. He had manipulated elected officials, charities, and even financial regulators. Here's how he pulled it off: fake investment portfolios, paperwork showing fake profits on investments that never existed, Ponzi payouts using money from new investors to pay earlier ones, keeping up the illusion, offshore laundering funds hidden through fake companies in tax havens across the globe, political protection, Campaign donations and elite parties ensured no one asked too many questions. Lifestyle, theater, private jets, luxury yachts, red carpet events, all to reinforce the fantasy. The final scene after his sentencing. Michael sat alone in a gray interrogation room. No team, no lawyers, no script. For the first time in his life, he had no narrative to spin. Just silence and a thick file full of his crimes sitting in front of him. The weight of it all finally pressing down. The trust he had stolen, irreplaceable. The money, mostly, gone hidden in crypto, off-the-record transfers, luxury homes in Dubai and Monaco. The damage, permanent. While some of the money from Thornton Global Investments was traced to offshore accounts in the Caribbean. The rest, simply in the digital ether. Authorities launched a global manhunt, issuing international warrants and working closely with Interpol and financial intelligence units across multiple countries. But Michael Thornton had been careful. Though he now sat behind bars, the fortune he'd stolen remained hidden, waiting to be claimed. And not everyone believed he'd remain in prison forever at Long Bay Correctional Complex. One of Australia's most secure prisons, Michael was placed under 24-hour surveillance. Officials feared he might attempt an escape, leveraging his vast network of contacts and undiscovered wealth. Their fears weren't unfounded. Even from within the walls of his maximum security cell, Michael still held power. Guards reported suspicious visits from lawyers linked to offshore banking firms. Investigators discovered that large sums were still being shuffled through shadowy accounts. Raising one chilling question: was someone still managing Michael's money? Rumors swirled, whispers of a loyal inner circle plotting his escape. Had the phantom financier truly been caged, or was this merely the calm before another storm? Weeks passed. The man once hailed as a financial genius, the one celebrated in glossy business magazines, honored at elite investment summits, and trusted by the ultra-wealthy, was now just another inmate, reduced to a prison number. His world confined to gray concrete, cold steel, and the unyielding rhythm of prison life. Australian media couldn't look away. Every fragment of his glamorous past, every hint of a possible escape, and every unconfirmed lead about the missing billions became headline news. His name had become synonymous with betrayal, greed, and high-stakes deception. But Michael hadn't surrendered. Not really. Behind the quiet demeanor and the prison uniform, he was still strategizing. He still had people on the outside. He still had money tucked away in places investigators hadn't uncovered. And he had spent his entire life staying 3 steps ahead. He wasn't about to stop now. Inside his tiny cell, the monotony was soul-crushing. Wake up at 6 a.m., breakfast on a plastic tray. Endless gray walls, a sliver of sky through a narrow window. He kept to himself, avoiding the other inmates. They were violent criminals, drug dealers, thieves, who stole with brutality. Michael had stolen with charm, with precision. They were reckless. He was calculated, or so he believed. The months dragged on. Authorities interrogated him repeatedly, but Michael never cracked. He denied knowledge of any undiscovered accounts, claimed innocence, played the victimized entrepreneur who only ever wanted to help people. No one believed him, but no one could prove otherwise either. Billions had simply evaporated. Outside, the fallout continued. Investors devastated by Thornton Global Investments begged for justice. Court battles dragged on. Some assets were liquidated and distributed, but it was pennies on the dollar. Many victims lost everything. Some couldn't bear the ruin and ended their lives. The damage wasn't just financial, it tore through families, shattered futures, and destroyed trust. And Michael, he stayed silent. Law enforcement suspected he was still orchestrating movements from inside. Calls were monitored, visitors scrutinized, legal correspondence dissected. Yet no link to the lost fortune ever surfaced. It was as though he had planned it, all: the collapse, the incarceration, the silence. Then, one night, everything changed. A guard making rounds found Michael lying on the floor of his cell, pale, weak, barely breathing, a nearly untouched meal tray beside him. He was rushed to the prison infirmary, then transferred under heavy guard to a secure wing at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. The diagnosis was unclear. Some speculated heart failure, others extreme stress, but the truth was far more elaborate. Michael had been preparing for this moment for months, skipping meals, feigning weakness, crafting the illusion of a body failing under pressure. Just sick enough to warrant hospital treatment, but not enough to die. It was a deception, one that had taken careful planning, and now, as doctors ran tests and guards adjusted their routines, Michael's opportunity had arrived. To outsiders, he looked like a man broken by guilt, a crumbling figure surrounded by beeping machines and sterile white walls. But beneath the frailty, subtle signs told a different story. Tiny muscle twitches, controlled breathing, half-lidded eyes that quietly scanned the room. Michael wasn't defeated. He was waiting. The hospital was locked down. 2 guards stood outside his door at all times. Security cameras watched his every move. Meals were checked. Visitors were frisked. Escape seemed impossible, exactly as Michael had intended. Then, at 2:47 a.m., the hospital reached its quietest hour. Dim corridors, the faint hum of medical equipment. The guards fought off fatigue. Inside the room, Michael lay perfectly still. His heart monitor beeped at a steady pace. Then, at precisely 2:49 a.m.-FLATLINE.A, piercing tone echoed from the monitor. A nurse rushed to check. Her eyes widened code blue. Doctors and nurses flooded the room. A crash cart rolled in. One of the guards stepped inside, tense but silent. Defibrillator pads were placed. Clear. Michael's body jerked from the shock. No response. Again, clear. Still nothing. 4 minutes passed. One nurse reached for a syringe of epinephrine, and that's when it happened. The lights went out. Total blackout. For a heartbeat. The hospital was plunged into darkness. Alarms screamed. Medical staff shouted orders. Guards fumbled for flashlights. Emergency systems kicked in, but not fast enough. In that brief window of chaos, Michael Thornton, the ghost of a fallen empire, made his final move. The disappearance of Michael Thornton. The hospital had gone eerily quiet. The soft hum of machines filled the sterile air, but then everything stopped. A sudden power outage plunged the facility into darkness. Emergency generators buzzed to life, but even they took nearly 30 seconds to restore the minimal lighting. And in those 30 seconds, Michael Thornton, Australia's most infamous white-collar criminal, was gone. His hospital bed was empty, cold, the sheets untouched. The monitors still blinked softly, still beeping, but the man they were meant to keep alive had vanished without a sound. The guards, stationed right outside the door, stood frozen. There were no windows, no vents large enough to crawl through, and no back exits. Just the one door guarded the entire time. Yet somehow, Michael had disappeared. Within minutes, chaos swept through the building. Security teams searched every hall and stairwell, checking closets and even ceiling tiles. Roadblocks sprang up around the city. Helicopters circled above. The news broke before sunrise. Australia's most notorious fraudster escapes. Michael Thornton vanishes from maximum security hospital. Theories exploded. Had he bribed hospital staff, faked his death, or received inside help from the very people meant to guard him? The truth was no one knew, because Michael wasn't just missing, he was gone. The escape plan of a mastermind. By the time authorities locked down airports, train stations, and docks, Michael Thornton was already thousands of miles away. His escape hadn't been a spontaneous act, it had been years in the making. He'd created new identities, complete with passports, foreign bank accounts, and offshore assets that no one had ever traced. Everything from the timing of the power failure to his fragile, sickly appearance had been part of a calculated illusion. He had deliberately weakened himself, just enough to be transferred from prison to hospital, knowing that the real opportunity for freedom lay not in chains but in a hospital gown. It was his final, perfect con, gone without a trace. Months passed. Interpol issued red notices. Intelligence agencies scoured financial records for signs of movement, but no accounts were touched. No suspicious travel, no sightings. Michael Thornton had beaten the system one last time. Eventually, the headlines faded. The news moved on to newer scandals and louder villains, but the people he defrauded, they didn't forget. Their lives were changed forever, and yet, somewhere on a quiet beach in a small country, with no extradition treaty, a man in his late 60s sat beneath the sun, watching the waves, sipping something cold. He had aged, but he was content. Michael Thornton had vanished from Australia's radar, but he hadn't vanished from the world. Case 3. The Desert Mirage. Tonight's next tale takes us from Australia to the scorched deserts of Arizona, where heat rises off the asphalt and the horizon never seems to end. It was the summer of 1998, and Arizona had seen its fair share of crime, drug trafficking, cartel violence, and corrupt land deals, but nothing prepared the state for what came next. At the center of the storm was a name that, until then, held no weight. Daniel "Danny" Calloway. He wasn't a drug lord. He wasn't a politician. He was a used car dealer. But behind that ordinary job title, Danny had built one of the most sophisticated criminal empires Arizona had ever seen. The rise of a phantom tycoon. He was in his early 40s, tall, always smirking, the kind of man whose presence made people uneasy without knowing why. He started small, buying and selling used cars in Phoenix. But there was a trick. He rolled back odometers, sold stolen vehicles with clean paperwork, and filed fraudulent loan documents to banks that never saw it coming. And while most would have stopped there, Danny D. IDN, single quotes T, by the mid-1990s, he had expanded into real estate scams, identity theft, and money laundering. He placed people inside banks, businesses, and even local government offices. He bought silence. He bought protection. And with it, he built a kingdom. The Desert Valley heist in 1998. Danny set his sights on something even bigger. Desert Valley Federal Credit Union, a mid-sized Arizona bank known for processing home loans. What it didn't have was strong cybersecurity. Over 2 years, Danny infiltrated the system, placing insiders, falsifying business records, and creating dozens of fake companies. Then, in June 1998, he made his move. A massive cyber intrusion was launched out within hours. Over $320 million had been rerouted, gone, hidden across shell companies, offshore accounts, and foreign properties. It was the biggest financial crime in Arizona's history, and for 3 weeks, no one noticed. A whisper in the system. It wasn't until July 5th that a low-level employee noticed something odd: mortgage applications linked to businesses that didn't exist. By the time the fraud team stepped in, it was already too late. The money had disappeared, the servers had been scrubbed, and Danny Calloway, he was gone, just like Michael Thornton before him. And then there was silence. Investigators scrambled. What had looked like mortgage fraud was now something much larger. A financial spiderweb that stretched through banks, casinos, and real estate holdings across the Southwest. But Danny had covered every trail. Some believe he died while fleeing. Others think he lives quietly under a new name, in a foreign country with warm nights and no questions asked. His empire collapsed, but the mystery, it remained. It wasn't just one con, it was dozens. Dozens of interconnected frauds woven directly into the framework of the bank's daily operations. By mid-July 1998, over $320 million had vanished. The money had been siphoned into a network of shell corporations that looked legitimate until they suddenly disappeared. Accounts went dark. corporate trails evaporated. Digital fingerprints led nowhere, ghost trails designed to mislead anyone who came looking. At the center of it all was Danny Calloway, a man who had vanished. The FBI, the Arizona Department of Financial Institutions, and the U.S. Treasury launched an aggressive investigation. Their first task: figure out how the fraud was pulled off. Teams dug into thousands of bank records, digital logs, and employee access reports. What emerged was a chilling portrait: a man who hadn't just stolen money, but had spent years building a trap, a system engineered to self-destruct the moment anyone started probing. Danny had thought of everything. Every company investigators found lead to another dead end. The assets, liquidated before the fraud even came to light. The corporate identities, built on stolen social security numbers from unsuspecting citizens. He'd planned every step, and yet there were cracks. A deeper look into the bank's security logs revealed something odd. While most of the major transfers had been routed to offshore accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Hong Kong, there were smaller sums, tens of thousands being funneled into local Arizona banks. It didn't fit. If Calloway had truly vanished, why leave anything behind? Then came the first real lead. A wire transfer of $775,000 had been sent to a luxury real estate firm in Sedona, Arizona, just days before the fraud was exposed. The recipient, a holding company registered under a meaningless name, until investigators traced it to one of Danny Calloway's known aliases. He was still in Arizona. By late July, authorities had narrowed their search to a sprawling $2.50 million estate hidden deep within the Red Rock Canyons. The property had been purchased in cash and fortified like a private compound. Surveillance cameras, reinforced gates, a private security team. For a man supposedly on the run, it was a curious choice. Not to flee the country, but to build a fortress. But the reason soon became clear. Inside that mansion, Danny wasn't hiding. He was building the next phase of his operation. The investigation into his network had uncovered a second layer, one even more audacious than the bank fraud. While authorities were chasing the stolen millions, Danny had already begun laundering the money into legitimate assets: luxury real estate, fine art, rare metals, and stock portfolios. He wasn't just hiding the money, he was legitimizing it. The plan was genius in its simplicity. By the time investigators caught up, the dirty money would be clean, indistinguishable from lawfully acquired wealth. And even if they seized what they could find, there would be far more they couldn't touch. But Calloway had made one mistake. He stayed too close. And on July 30th, 1998, the feds made their move at dawn. Federal agents, SWAT teams, and financial crime specialists descended on the estate in a meticulously coordinated raid. The sun had barely crested the horizon. The air was still, thick with desert heat and tension. Agents had studied the property for weeks. Aerial surveillance, motion logs, undercover stakeouts. They approached from 3 directions, cutting off every possible exit. At the main gate, they bypassed the security grid in seconds. But a silent alarm tripped. No more time to wait. The team surged forward. The front entrance was there first. Obstacle: a steel-plated door designed less for safety than for siege. A second team breached a side window, scaling the canyon-facing walls, blasting through tempered glass with precision charges. Inside, a strange glow welcomed them. LED lights flickering across rows of monitors, control panels, and encrypted systems. A full-blown command center. This was no safe house. This was a live operation. Room by room, agents swept the mansion. In one office, they found stacks of burner phones, passports with different identities. Each one prepped for an escape that never happened. In another server's word, silently, holding the keys to hundreds of hidden accounts, layered with false identities and digital deception. Then, beyond a biometric locked corridor, They found him. Danny Calloway sat in a leather chair in a private study, a glass of whiskey untouched at his side. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He just watched, like he'd known this moment was coming all along. When agents finally placed the cuffs around his wrists, it became clear this wasn't just a fraud. This was an empire, and one that didn't need him anymore. Even as they hauled him out, the servers kept running. Money kept moving. Transactions still processed. The machine had been set in motion long before today, and it would take far more than one arrest to shut it down. As Danny was escorted through the massive stone entryway of his estate, his face remained unreadable, eerily calm, almost detached. Federal agents swept every room, seizing documents, dismantling computer systems, gathering the pieces of a criminal architecture built to last. Outside, the Arizona sun cast long shadows across the red earth. A convoy of black SUVs waited, engines low and ready to roll. Calloway was headed to a federal holding facility, but his reach, that was still unraveling. Calloway's financial network wasn't confined to Sedona or even the United States. His schemes had infected investment firms, hedge funds, private equity groups, and offshore accounts across the globe. He had embedded his operations so deeply that even the world's best forensic accountants would spend years trying to untangle it all. Inside the estate, analysts were already hard at work, but as they would soon realize, what Danny Calloway built wasn't just a fraud, it was a legacy of deception, one that didn't collapse with his arrest. It had only just begun. What investigators uncovered inside the Calloway estate was more elaborate than they had ever anticipated. Behind the mansion's pristine walls were layers of secrecy. Built-in safes lined every hallway, each containing stacks of encrypted drives. Handwritten ledgers, coded in a cipher, understood only by Calloway and a select circle of loyal confidants. Expensive artwork purchased via dark web marketplaces served as conduits for laundering illicit funds. Every item told a story, a stolen identity here, a fake corporation there. Money moved through shell accounts in the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia, routed through real estate firms, consulting agencies, and even charitable foundations, all existing only to camouflage and redistribute billions. But what left investigators stunned wasn't just the scale of the fraud, it was Calloway's foresight. He had prepared for this moment long before it arrived. In the weeks leading up to his arrest, Calloway had begun quietly dismantling his visible empire. He liquidated assets, transferred holdings to nameless digital entities, and moved wealth into untraceable cryptocurrencies. The estate was nothing more than a facade stage set to distract. His true empire existed beyond walls, beyond borders, beyond reach. As dawn broke over the Arizona desert, the final agents exited the estate. Calloway, now shackled and transported in a convoy of armored SUVs, sat silent and still. To the agents, it appeared as though the mastermind had finally been brought to justice, his empire dismantled, his wealth seized, his power stripped away. But inside the vehicle, Calloway didn't look defeated. There was no panic in his eyes, no despair in his expression, because he understood one truth. Power didn't belong to those who held the keys, it belonged to those who controlled the information. Back at the estate, forensic teams worked around the clock. Every hard drive, every ciphered document, even the most insignificant scraps of paper were cataloged. Their goal was clear: dismantle Calloway's network completely. But in their meticulous search, they overlooked the most critical flaw in their approach. Calloway's empire didn't exist in the physical world. It had never been about the real estate, the offshore accounts, or even the art. It was always about the code. His entire operation was built on decentralized networks, smart contracts, and self-operating algorithms. The infrastructure he had created was automated, self-healing, and deliberately designed to outlive him. Months before his arrest, Calloway had triggered sequences that would continue to move money, activate protocols, and reroute control without any human input. Now held in a maximum security detention center, Calloway remained entirely silent. Yet, at that very moment, his systems were executing instructions written long ago. Transactions moved through blockchain channels beyond the reach of any government. Former identities linked to Calloway were being erased and reassigned by scripts he had coded years prior, as he was led into an interrogation room. His wrists bound in steel, federal agents around the world began to notice something was wrong. In London, a senior investment executive stared in disbelief as millions vanished from a frozen account, funneled through an encrypted path to an unknown destination. Asterisk. In Hong Kong, a corporate lawyer received a notification that stunned him. One of Calloway's former shell companies had just appointed new directors. The firm, under investigation and scheduled for seizure, had already liquidated its assets and converted the funds into cryptocurrency, gone without a trace. In New York, a federal agent noticed entire folders from the seized digital archives had been wiped. Not stolen, just gone. Vanished by an internal kill switch buried in the code. Law enforcement scrambled, but for every account frozen, 2 more shifted. Every asset traced was already gone. Calloway's ghost empire wasn't just surviving, was evolving, morphing, growing. The agents realized, too late, they hadn't captured a kingpin. They had captured a shadow inside his dim cell. Reinforced concrete walls closing in, Calloway sat motionless on a metal bench. No connections, no communications. And yet, the world outside was unraveling. His empire was still operating invisible, unstoppable. The guards whispered in confusion. Some questioned if the man in the cell was even Calloway at all, or just a decoy, a pawn willingly sacrificed, while the real mastermind remained hidden in the depths of cyberspace. And then came the first real wave. A government pension fund in Canada lost $200 million overnight. A Swiss bank reported sudden, inexplicable liquidation of dozens of anonymous numbered accounts. And in Singapore, a trusted intermediary was found dead, his apartment emptied, his laptop destroyed, his name erased from multiple corporate registries. None of it could be traced back. None of it could be stopped. Calloway hadn't built a financial scheme. He had created something far more dangerous, a system that no longer needed its creator. And in that silence, the hum of security cameras, the only sound, Calloway finally blinked and smiled. Case 4. The Empire Beneath the Dust, a catastrophic failure, rippled through a secure federal database in Washington, D.C.'s servers crippled by a flood of encrypted transactions that defied logic. Thousands of miles away in Switzerland, an offshore bank tied to Calloway's financial empire collapsed overnight. Its reserves drained through a string of transactions that regulators could neither trace nor halt. And it wasn't over. Every time authorities believed they had reached the bottom of Calloway's empire, they uncovered a deeper layer, another deception, a fresh misdirection. The system was no longer just reacting, it was fighting back. By the time the FBI fully grasped the scale of what was unfolding, it was too late. Calloway's network had evolved. It was no longer just a criminal enterprise. It was self-sustaining. It had become alive. And Calloway, the man they had so triumphantly captured, was no longer required for it to survive. Somewhere in a place no agency could reach, the final phase of his plan had already begun. A new identity, a new system, an empire reborn. And this time, no one would see him coming. Case for the sun dipped low over the arid New Mexico horizon, casting long shadows across desolate highways and rugged plateaus. In the distance, a dust storm swirled menacingly toward Albuquerque city, now unknowingly entangled in one of the most insidious criminal empires in American history. At the heart of it was a man named Vitor Salazar, a name that would haunt law enforcement for decades to come. To the public, Salazar was the embodiment of success, a refined businessman in tailored suits, a philanthropist rubbing shoulders with political elites, a pillar of the community. He owned a chain of luxury car dealerships, high-end real estate ventures, and a private security firm catering to the Southwest's wealthiest. But that was all a facade. Beneath his pristine image was something far darker, an empire built, not on entrepreneurship, but on violence, manipulation, and absolute control. Salazar was no common criminal. He was an architect of corruption. Behind the shell companies, offshore accounts, and bogus non-profits lay a sprawling web of organized crime, so sophisticated, it became almost invisible. He embedded his operation into the very fabric of New Mexico's infrastructure. It started small drug trafficking, smuggling routes, laundering money through nightclubs and auto dealerships. But soon, his empire grew bolder, more intricate. Construction fraud became his most lucrative venture. Bridges, highways, and public buildings awarded to companies he secretly controlled. Millions in taxpayer dollars were siphoned off into phantom subcontractors, forged invoices, and accounts with no traceable owner. Projects were left unfinished. Structures built with substandard materials put lives at risk. And all the while, the money kept flowing, drained from the public, funneled into Salazar's network. Despite rising suspicion, he remained untouchable. He had paid off everyone: local police, state officials, judges. Evidence vanished. Witnesses disappeared. Whispers of his power echoed in political circles, but no one dared speak his name aloud. Those who tried ended up financially destroyed or buried in the desert. But the true horror of Salazar's empire lay beneath the surface. Under the streets of Albuquerque stretched a hidden labyrinth of tunnels. Officially, they were part of underground infrastructure projects. In reality, they were the arteries of a hidden world, some used for drug manufacturing, others for something far more disturbing: human trafficking. This subterranean network moved people like freight, desperate immigrants promised work and shelter, only to be stripped of their identities and freedom. Some were forced into labor, others into industries too grim to name. To Salazar, these weren't people. They were assets, commodities, and in his underworld, profit was everything. For over a decade, federal agents tried to build a case, but Salazar never left a fingerprint. He never handled cash. His associates only knew fragments of the operation, never the full picture. That was the brilliance of his design. Layers within layers, so that even if one piece fell, the structure held. But all empires, no matter how deeply rooted, eventually crack. The first fissure appeared in the form of Daniel Ortega, a disillusioned accountant who had helped shuffle Salazar's money for years. Ortega had once been loyal, but after witnessing one atrocity too many, he made a choice that would change everything. He walked into the FBI with a trove of classified financial records detailing laundering operations, offshore holdings, and the inner workings of Salazar's criminal empire. The information was explosive. Within days, federal authorities launched the largest criminal investigation in New Mexico's history. Raids were executed, properties seized, subpoenas rained down. But Salazar, he was gone. Some said he fled the country. Others believed he disappeared into the very tunnels he had built. A new identity, a clean slate. And then investigators discovered something chilling. Beneath one of Salazar's abandoned warehouses, they found a newly constructed tunnel. But this one was different. It wasn't built for smuggling. It was an escape route, leading deep into the mountains, ending at a hidden airstrip. No cameras, no digital trail, no witnesses. It was as if Salazar had erased himself. Months passed, then years, and still no sign of him. Though his empire was wounded, it had not crumbled. Some whispered that he still pulled the strings from the shadows, that his influence was too deeply embedded to die. In the end, the story of Victor Salazar wasn't just about corruption or crime. It was about a man who understood that true power doesn't come from being seen. It comes from being untouchable. The empire beneath Victor Salazar's grip on New Mexico's underworld ran so deep that even after he vanished, removing him entirely proved impossible. Even now, whispers linger of sightings in border towns, of a quiet man in a dark suit boarding private jets under false names, always just beyond the reach of justice. In hushed corners of Albuquerque, among those who truly knew him, one question refuses to die. Was Victor Salazar truly gone, or was he simply waiting for the right moment to return? In the chaotic months following his disappearance, New Mexico found itself in a fragile state of unease. Authorities had dismantled significant branches of his empire. They uncovered vast networks of financial fraud on an industrial scale, human trafficking corridors, and deeply embedded drug smuggling routes. Properties were seized, assets were frozen, dozens of close associates were arrested. But despite the crackdown, one fact became undeniable. Salazar's empire was wounded, not dead. Fragments of his operation lived on. Some lieutenants had gone underground, while others continued operating in isolation, fragmented cells, awaiting orders that would never come. His absence left a vacuum, and the criminal underworld of New Mexico was thrown into chaos. Initially, the FBI believed that time would do the rest, that, without its head, Salazar's syndicate would collapse. But as weeks turned into months, the opposite proved true. Financial transactions began mirroring the exact patterns of his previous operations. Fraudulent construction bids were being submitted under new company names. Offshore accounts, frozen, were quietly moving enormous sums of money, and most unsettling of all, drug shipments continued to move north through smuggling, tunnels long believed decommissioned. It was as if nothing had changed. Then came the sightings. Vague at first, shadowy figure resembling Salazar, seen at a high-end casino in Las Vegas, a private jet departing a dusty Arizona airstrip, a hotel check-in using an alias long tied to his past crimes. But then came something far more concrete. A former money launderer, known only as Marco, had once worked for Salazar. After the takedown, Marco agreed to testify against operatives and was placed in witness protection. In December, he contacted his federal handler with a chilling message. He's not dead. He's not gone. He's watching. Special Agent William Knox arranged an emergency meeting. Marco arrived, visibly shaken. In his hands was an unmarked package he'd received at his safe house. Inside, a single photograph. It was grainy, taken from a distance but unmistakable. It showed Marco sitting in his car outside a grocery store, taken just 2 days earlier. There was no message, no return address, just a silent, undeniable truth. Someone had found him. If Salazar was truly alive and orchestrating operations from the shadows, it meant he had not only escaped capture, but retained full control of a global criminal network. The FBI's best working theory. Salazar had vanished, according to a meticulous escape plan, years in the making. Offshore identities, decoy accounts, safe houses, across South America, Europe, and the Caribbean. Every angle had been anticipated. But one terrifying possibility began to gain traction. What if Salazar had never left New Mexico at all? As forensic analysts combed through what remained of his holdings, they found something strange: construction records buried inside fraudulent contracts, permits filed by non-existent companies. One set of blueprints pointed to an abandoned mining site deep in the New Mexico desert. Satellite images showed only barren land, a forgotten place lost to time. But when agents arrived at the location, what they found defied explanation. Beneath what looked like a collapsed mine entrance was a reinforced steel hatch nearly impervious to excavation. After hours of effort, the team managed to pry it open. Inside, a staircase spiraled downward into darkness. What they discovered wasn't a bunker, it was a fortress. A massive underground facility stretched nearly half a mile below the surface. Halls lined with reinforced concrete, powered by independent generators and stocked with long-term supplies. The air was stale, the silence suffocating. Computer servers still ran, warm to the touch, and then they found it. At the farthest point of the bunker, a small desk. On it, an open laptops, still connected. The screen displayed live surveillance feeds from across New Mexico, police precincts, government buildings, the homes of federal agents involved in the case. In the center of it all lay a sealed envelope addressed to the FBI. Inside, a handwritten note. You think you buried me. You only buried the past. The future belongs to those who understand the game. V.S. There were no fingerprints, no trace of when he'd last been there. Just one unmistakable message. He was still out there, and he was still in control. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Bureau. Every known alias, shell company, and suspected hideout was re-examined. Surveillance was tightened across every port, private airstrip, and major highway in the Southwest. The agency's top behavioral profilers were brought in to predict his next move, but it didn't matter. Salazar remained a ghost, always one step ahead, and that was the most haunting realization of all. He never really left, despite their best efforts. His empire had evolved into something more decentralized, more elusive. Financial data revealed ongoing schemes, smarter and more insulated than before. It wasn't just a criminal network anymore. It was a machine, a system built to survive without its architect. And somewhere, in the silence of the desert, Victor Salazar was still watching. Millions of dollars were still flowing quietly and efficiently through Shell, corporations once tied to Salazar's sprawling business empire. These funds snake their way through offshore accounts in nations notorious for their tight banking secrecy laws. Meanwhile, tunnels once believed sealed along the Mexican border were found to be fully operational again. Drug shipments were moving north, vanishing without a trace into the vastness of the American Southwest. It felt orchestrated, calculated, as if Salazar had seen every move coming, as if he had planned his own disappearance long before authorities even began to close in. And then, something even more chilling. One cold, January morning, as the FBI was finalizing a report on the underground compound discovered in the New Mexico desert, a package arrived at the Albuquerque field office. No return address, no markings. Inside, a single USB drive and a handwritten note in the same elegant script as before. You still don't understand the game, but you will, when plugged into a secure forensic system. The drive revealed encrypted files, dozens of them. After hours of painstaking decryption, the contents came to light. Surveillance footage, schematics, internal documents, blueprints, all targeting sites across New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. But one folder changed everything. It was labeled simply, Watch List. Inside were dossiers on dozens of people, law enforcement officers, federal judges, prosecutors, politicians, every major figure involved in the investigation. Each file was disturbingly thorough. Home addresses, daily routines, family members, names, photographs taken from dangerously close range. It wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. Salazar wasn't running, he was watching. The realization sent shockwaves through every agency involved. The FBI thought they were closing in on a fugitive, a man desperate to stay free, but the truth was far more terrifying. They were the prey. He was the hunter. Security protocols were immediately overhauled. Federal protection was assigned to judges and prosecutors. Surveillance units were deployed to guard the families of key agents. But the warning had been made clear. Salazar wasn't finished. Then the strange incidents began. First, mysterious break-ins swept across New Mexico. The targets: government, offices, elite law firms, and banks linked to Salazar's investigation. Yet, nothing of monetary value was taken. Instead, one thing was always missing: a hard drive USB sticker, single document, all connected to the case. Then people began to vanish low-level. operatives who had flipped for immunity, former employees willing to testify. One by one, they disappeared. No ransom notes, no bodies, just silence. In some homes, signs of forced entry. Vehicles left running or abandoned miles away. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. Then came the event that shattered what was left of their confidence. In March, a judge overseeing one of Salazar's associate trials was found dead at home. Initial cause, heart attack. But a deeper forensic analysis uncovered a tiny puncture wound at the base of his neck. The toxicology report revealed something else. A rare neurotoxin, nearly undetectable, used in only a handful of known cases worldwide. This was no coincidence. This was an execution. Panic gripped the task force. If Salazar was responsible, and all signs pointed that way, then his reach extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. Witnesses withdrew. Lawyers stepped down. Agents began to question whether this was a war they could actually win. The breaking point came when a former associate of Salazar, placed in witness protection, was found dead in a remote Colorado cabin. His body had been arranged, hands clasped in prayer. On the wall, smeared in his own blood, were 3 words: "He is coming." The urgency shifted overnight. The FBI, DE, even Interpol mobilized in force. They investigated every safe house, asset, and known affiliate. Satellites scanned the desert. Drones swept canyons and abandoned infrastructure. But every lead vanished. Trail ended in smoke. Salazar was always one step ahead, toying with them, watching them scramble, and then silence. The murders stopped. The break-ins ceased. No messages, no threats. Salazar had vanished again. With no leads, the investigation slowed. Politicians moved on. Media attention faded. The public forgot. But those closest to the case knew better. They knew that silence wasn't peace. It was a warning. A reset then. One October morning, everything changed. A battered man stumbled into a gas station outside Santa Fe, bruised, bloodied, and barely conscious. The clerk rushed to help him, then froze. He recognized the face. Javier Sosa, one of top lieutenants, presumed dead for over a year. Sosa was taken into FBI custody immediately, but what he revealed in the interrogation room sent chills through the entire bureau. The man who had once pledged his life to Salazar was now a trembling wreck, paranoid, rambling. "He's still here," Sosa whispered. "You don't understand. You never did." He claimed Salazar had never left New Mexico. The stories about fleeing to South America or Eastern Europe lies a smokescreen, asterisk in truth. Salazar had gone underground, literally. The agents assumed Sosa was speaking metaphorically until he continued. He built a new city, he said, under the desert. He described a vast subterranean net, bunkers, safe houses, stretching for miles beneath New Mexico, hidden beneath ghost towns, beneath abandoned mines, beneath places no one ever thought to search. Salazar hadn't just disappeared. He had gone deeper. He was obsessed with control, always calculating, always with a contingency plan. When law enforcement closed in, Salazar didn't panic. He simply vanished, slipping deeper into the shadows like he had rehearsed it 100 times. But what truly terrified investigators was what Sosa claimed came next. "There's no leaving," Sosa said. "Not alive." According to him, anyone who tried to break free, anyone who showed even a hint of disloyalty, was systematically eliminated. These weren't random acts of violence. They were cold, calculated purges carried out by Salazar himself. The disappearances that had haunted the investigation were executions, surgical removals to protect the Empire's secrecy. And still, Salazar had endured. Even underground, literally, he continued to rebuild. He wasn't evading justice. He was orchestrating a war from beneath the earth. If even a fraction of Sosa's story was true, then the FBI hadn't been hunting Salazar at all. He had been hunting them. For the first time in over a year, they had a lead. Sosa gave them a location, a remote desert stretch, isolated from civilization, miles from any road. He claimed it was one of the entrances to Salazar's underground network. Not the main base, just a doorway. The Bureau didn't hesitate. Within hours, a full tactical team was mobilized: SWAT, forensic units, specialists in subterranean search and rescue. As they approached the coordinates, a creeping dread settled over them. The desert was silent, vast, empty, unfeeling. At first, all they found was an abandoned gas station, half buried by sand and time. The windows were shattered, the sign unreadable, the structure crumbling from decades of neglect. It looked like just another relic of a forgotten past, until they found the hatch. Buried beneath the rusted remains of an old truck, hidden beneath debris, was a steel-reinforced door, industrial grade, designed to never be found. When they pried it open, a wave of freezing air rushed out from the darkness below. Flashlights snapped on. One by one, they descended. The air was thick, stale, as though the place had been sealed for decades. But not empty. They entered a vast, underground chamber. Crude wiring stretched across concrete walls. Flickering bulbs cast jagged, twitching shadows. But the most disturbing thing wasn't what they set, was what they didn't. No guards, no workers, not a soul in sight. It was empty, too empty. Then they saw the message, painted across the far wall in thick, smeared letters. Too late. The realization hit them all at once. This wasn't a hideout. It was a trap. An explosion tore through the chamber, a deafening blast that collapsed the ceiling above. Dust choked the air. Walls split. Reinforced tunnels groaned and buckled as the team scrambled for their lives. By the time they reached the surface, the entrance was gone, buried under fire and rubble. Salazar had known. He'd been watching, and once again, he had disappeared. In the days that followed, frustration turned to humiliation. Every supposed lead, every victory, had been part of his game. The man they thought they were closing in on had been orchestrating every move. The destruction of the underground base was more than an escape bait, was a message. Salazar wasn't just a criminal. He was a tactician, and they had never been his hunters. They were his pieces. But then the silence changed. No more disappearances. No more cryptic taunts. No signs of Salazar's presence at all. For a moment, it seemed like he had finally vanished. But no one truly believed he was gone. Then came the whispers. Rumors spreading like wildfire across New Mexico's underworld. Something had happened. Something had changed. The FBI intensified their efforts, desperate to understand. And that's when a new name emerged. A name that hadn't been mentioned in connection with Salazar before. Vera Santiago, at first. She was a ghost, no criminal record, no known affiliations, not even a photo in law enforcement databases. But the people who understood the streets, who lived in that world, they knew. Vera Santiago wasn't just anyone. She was Salazar's most dangerous secret. She had always been there, a phantom in the background, never on camera, never in documents, not once named by informants. And yet, her influence had shaped everything. Salazar may have been the face of the empire, but Vera, she was its architect, and now, she was in control. In the weeks following Salazar's disappearance, something strange happened. The violence stopped. The flow of drugs, weapons, money, it all slowed. For the first time in over a decade. It looked like the empire was crumbling, but then the bodies started surfacing. Not random dealers or level, THUGS high-ranking members of Salazar's inner circle. Men who had ruled with impunity now, found dead. Some were discovered in their homes, clean shots to the head. Others pulled from the Rio Grande, their bodies weighted and disfigured. There were no notes, no messages, just methodical executions, cold, clinical, controlled. The whisper on the streets was clear. This wasn't Salazar, this was her. And then came the breakthrough. A grainy surveillance video from a rundown motel in Albuquerque. A woman entering a room late at night. The footage meant nothing until the motel manager recognized the man she was meeting. Javier Sosa. The same man who'd walked into a gas station months earlier. The same man who led the FBI into the underground trap. He had vanished after the explosion, and now he was back. Meeting with Vera Santiago. The Bureau didn't hesitate. They mobilized again, this time prepared for war. But what they didn't know was that Vera wasn't just continuing Salazar's legacy. She was rewriting it. And this time, the rules had changed. Case 4. The ghost of Salazar. When agents finally closed in on the rundown motel, they moved with surgical precision, shadows in the night. But when they breached the room, the scene that greeted them was eerily silent. Victor Sosa, once Salazar's loyal enforcer, was already dead. A single bullet to the chest. No struggle, no weapon, no sign of forced entry. Just Sosa, slumped against the wall, his eyes frozen in shock, and a message written in blood across the motel mirror. You're looking in the wrong place. The FBI understood exactly what it meant. This wasn't about Salazar anymore. This was something bigger. In the months that followed, Vera Santiago disappeared, once more vanished, as suddenly as she'd returned. The killings stopped. The sprawling criminal network Salazar once ruled over crumbled into dust. It was as if someone had methodically erased every trace of his empire. But Salazar himself was never found. Some believed he'd been killed during the purges. Others swore he'd escaped, again, slipping deeper into the shadows where no one could follow. But those who truly knew him, who had studied his obsession with control, understood one thing: death wasn't Salazar's style. If he was gone, there would have been a message, a legacy, a final move. But instead, there was silence. And that was far more terrifying. Then came the first letter. It arrived on a cold morning in Santa Fe, addressed to Special Agent Daniel Mercer. A plain white envelope, no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper that read, "You buried the wrong bodies." There was no signature, no DNA, no fingerprints. The paper was spotless, clean, intentional. Mercer's blood ran cold. The message was clear. Salazar was still alive. Weeks passed, and more letters followed. One was sent to a veteran crime reporter in Albuquerque, who had covered Salazar's reign for years. It read, "Not everything that disappears is lost." Then, another, "The dead don't always stay dead. Some debts can never be repaid. You were always looking for the wrong man." The messages grew bolder, more mocking. Salazar wasn't just alive. He was watching them, waiting, planning. But planning for what? The answer came in blood. Police were called to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Las Cruces. Inside, they found 12 bodies each, executed with a single bullet to the head. No struggle, no forced entry, just cold, clinical death. And on the walls, written in blood, were the same messages from the letters. This wasn't a warning. Asterisk, it was a declaration. The victims were quickly identified, not random casualties, but members of Vera Santiago's inner circle, the very people who had helped destroy Salazar's empire. Now, they were gone, erased. The FBI realized, too late, that Vera hadn't destroyed Salazar. She had only delayed him. He had waited patiently, silently, and now he was back, not as the kingpin of a drug empire, but something far worse. Something unseen. Something no one could predict. And this time, there would be no warnings. Only death. Case 5. The rise and fall of Trong Nguyen Lan, the heart of Ho Chi Minh City, where the buzz of business never sleeps. One name towered above all in Vietnam's real estate empire: Trong Nguyen Lan. Born on October 13, 1956, in Saigon to a family of Chinese-Vietnamese heritage, Lan began with humble roots, selling hair accessories. But by 1992, she had founded Vien Thon Fat Group, a luxury real estate conglomerate that would become a symbol of wealth and influence across the country. Her empire expanded with astonishing speed. By 2012, Lan had gained control over Saigon Joint Stock Commercial Bank, SCB, Vietnam's largest bank by assets. But behind the gleaming facade of wealth and power lay an intricate maze of financial manipulation. Lan's control over SCB was shrouded in secrecy. Investigators would later uncover that, through over 24 intermediaries, she had funneled 93% of the bank's loans into her own companies and shell entities. The true scale of her scheme didn't unravel until October 2022. After years of secret probes, Vietnamese authorities arrested Lan. The charges were staggering: over $12.5 billion USD embezzled through 9,116 fraudulent loan applications between 2018 and 22. To dot the financial shock rippled across Vietnam, public trust in SCB collapsed. Within days, depositors panicked. 3 bank employees tragically died by suicide. The crisis escalated into a national scandal in March 2024. Lan's trial began at the Ho Chi Minh City People's Court. It was one of the largest corruption trials in Vietnam's history. 82 other defendants stood with her, including top executives from SCB, state bank officials, and government inspectors. Testimony revealed the breadth of the scheme. With the help of her niece, Trong Hu Van Lan had created 52 shell companies and for front-facing businesses to secure 155 loans from SCB. The funds were siphoned straight into her empire. On April 11, 2024, the verdict was delivered. Lan was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Her niece received 17 years. Others faced sentences ranging from life imprisonment to suspended terms. The embezzled sum was so vast it represented nearly 3% of Vietnam's GDP, a staggering number that laid bare the vulnerabilities in the nation's financial system. In the aftermath, the Vietnamese government launched sweeping reforms to tighten banking oversight and restore public confidence. Once hailed as a self-made tycoon, Trong My Lan's empire was built on illusion and deceit. Her rise had been no accident. It was a masterclass in manipulation. But in the end, her ambition consumed her. Her story, once held up as a model of entrepreneurial brilliance, became a stark warning. When money, power, and corruption dance too closely, the fall is always fatal. Case 5. The Rise and Fall of Trong My Lan. In the early days of her career, Trong My Lan was not just building a real estate empire, she was constructing a fortress of influence. She forged close ties with powerful figures in both government and banking, ensuring that her ventures were never starved of funding or slowed by red tape. Unlike those chasing fast profits, Lan was strategic, methodical, and above all, patient. She played the long game. As Vietnam transitioned from a centrally planned economy to a market-driven powerhouse, foreign investments poured in and real estate flourished. Lan saw opportunity in land, a limited commodity, destined only to rise in value. She secured prime urban plots in Ho Chi Minh City, Hanoi, and other key cities through transactions so murky they left behind almost no paper trail. Her most powerful move came when she acquired Saigon Joint Stock Commercial Bank, SCB. With it, she gained access to what was essentially an open vault, allowing her to fund massive developments without the need for outside lenders. But as her reach expanded, so did the risks. Real estate is a leveraged game, and much of Lan's wealth was tied up in projects that hadn't yet broken even. To keep the illusion of liquidity and financial health, she began borrowing even more, primarily from SCB itself. She routed funds through a tangle of shell companies, using the bank's capital to bankroll her own ventures. On paper, everything checked out. The loans were documented, the collateral looked sound, and SCB's books appeared clean. But beneath the surface, It was a house of cards. By 2018, Trung Mi Lan had become nearly untouchable. She was deeply entrenched in the country's elite circles, a generous donor to political campaigns, a patron of the arts, and a name spoken with reverence. When whispers of irregularities emerged, they were quickly silenced. Regulators backed off. Few wanted to be the one to pull the thread that could unravel the entire financial fabric. And for a while, it worked. Then came 22-2, as global markets faltered and Vietnam's economy felt the pressure. The real estate boom began to slow. Investor confidence waned, liquidity dried up, and SCB, the engine behind Lan's empire, began to buckle under the weight of withdrawal demands. With panic setting in, the government intervened. The arrest of Trung Mi Lan sent shockwaves across Vietnam. This wasn't just the downfall of a business mogul, it was a reckoning for the country's financial system. When investigators finally accessed SCB's internal records, the scale of fraud was staggering. More than 900 fake loan applications, 52 front companies, and over $122.5 billion embezzled, more than the GDP of some nations. The fallout was swift. SCB was placed under state supervision. Its top executives were either arrested or forced to resign. Depositors, many of them ordinary citizens, were devastated, with their life savings trapped in the wreckage. The Vietnamese government scrambled to stabilize the situation, injecting emergency funds in a desperate bid to contain the damage. But the confidence was already shattered. Vietnam's standing in global financial markets took a hit. Foreign investors pulled out. Banks across the country tightened lending. The once booming property market froze. Cranes stalled. Construction sites went silent. Towering skeletons of half-finished skyscrapers now cast long shadows over cities that once symbolized growth. Meanwhile, Trung Mi Lan awaited trial for a woman who once dined with politicians and commanded billions. Prison was a stark contrast. Gone were the designer clothes and personal assistants. Now, she wore a prison uniform, ate cafeteria food, and followed a strict daily routine. Still, she kept her composure, a woman trained for decades to control the narrative, but not this time. Her trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming, and in a country where financial crimes of this magnitude are met with the harshest penalties, there was only one outcome. In a packed courtroom, the judge, known for presiding over Vietnam's most notorious corruption cases, delivered the verdict: death by lethal injection. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, but few were surprised. Lan, however, showed no emotion. She had played the game of power at the highest levels. She had shaped the economy of a nation, but in the end, even she couldn't outrun the truth. Her sentencing sent a ripple of fear through Vietnam's elite. Those who once toasted her success now publicly distanced themselves. The question on everyone's mind wasn't whether she was guilty, but how many others had helped her rise, because an empire that large doesn't fall alone. SCB's collapse triggered a chain reaction. Other banks, fearing scrutiny, pulled back on loans. Real estate investments vanished. Thousands of families lost their savings. Small businesses saw credit lines evaporate. The impact wasn't just national, it echoed globally, as investors questioned Vietnam's financial stability. Trung Mi Lan was eventually transferred to a high-security prison on the outskirts of Ho Chi Minh City, isolated, forgotten, a relic of a corrupt system. She spent her final days in reflection, stripped of the control she once wielded so effortlessly. No favors left to call in, no escape plan. On the day of her execution, there were no ceremonies, no visitors, just the sound of her footsteps echoing down a gray hallway. She didn't resist. She didn't beg. She knew the rules of the game. She just never expected to lose. And with a final breath, the woman who once controlled billions, who once moved markets and bent governments to her will, was gone. But the consequences of her actions were just beginning to unfold. In the weeks that followed, the Vietnamese government launched one of its largest ever crackdowns on corruption, sweeping through the banking and real estate sectors like wildfire. The message was clear. No one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. Yet for the thousands left in financial ruin, and for the country's bruised reputation, it was a lesson learned too late. Tr Kang My Land's empire now stands as a cautionary tale, not just of greed, but of what happens when power, money, and silence collide. The collapse of Trong My Land's empire. Executives were arrested, their assets seized, and those high-ranking officials who had once turned a blind eye to Trong My Land's operations were quietly removed from power. The Vietnamese government issued public assurances, vowing a new era of financial transparency. But behind closed doors, many doubted real reform would follow. Internationally, the scandal sent tremors through Vietnam's reputation. Once a hotspot for foreign investment, confidence evaporated. Investors feared deep-rooted corruption and unseen financial risks. The stock market faltered, growth slowed. What had once seemed like a rising economic miracle now stood, exposed, fragile, and deceptive. The fall of Land's empire was more than a personal downfall. It was a national reckoning in the heart of Vietnam's major cities. The ruins of her empire still lingered in finished skyscrapers, shuttered luxury malls, and vacant penthouses. Silent monuments to a dream turned to dust, while a few of her former associates resurfaced under new names and industries. Most were unable to escape the shadow of the scandal. It had become a permanent stain on the nation's history, written in billions lost and lives shattered. Yet even in the ashes, new players emerged. Another bank, another entrepreneur, another scheme, because greed, like history, has a way of repeating itself. Asterisk, the collapse of Saigon Commercial Bank, SCB, the centerpiece of Land's operation, sent shockwaves through Vietnam's economy and political system. Government agencies rushed to contain the damage. Officials assured citizens that savings were safe, that the financial system was resilient, and that justice would be swift. But behind closed doors, the panic was real. Investigators worked around the clock to unravel the tangled web of fraud. What they found was more extensive than anyone had imagined. Land's empire had been hidden beneath layers of offshore accounts, shell companies, and real estate portfolios so vast they spanned continents. Assets were frozen, properties seized. International law enforcement, from Interpol to the FBI, joined the hunt, tracing the trails of laundered money across borders. Rumors swirled that foreign banks had aided in the laundering, and whispers spread of complicity from powerful figures in Hong Kong and Singapore. But the real threat lay closer to home. Tr Kang My Land had not built her empire alone. Ministers, bureaucrats, even military officials had profited from her rise. Some approved fraudulent loans, others ignored violations in exchange for favors. Now, with Land behind bars, their secrets were at risk. Sudden resignations followed. Executives vanished from public life. Some fled to nations without extradition treaties. Others were not so lucky. One by one, arrests were made. Former SCB executives, real estate magnates, government regulators. Some cooperated, offering names and documents for lighter sentences. Others clung to innocence. But the evidence was overwhelming: bribes recorded, whistleblowers testifying, and transaction logs revealing a years-long pattern of deception. The trials were swift and heavily publicized. The government needed a scapegoat and a message. No one was untouchable. Prison sentences were handed down, assets stripped, restitution ordered, but much of the money was hidden in accounts that would never be traced. Despite these efforts, the damage had already taken root. The economy struggled. Foreign investors stayed away, fearing another collapse. Small businesses, once fueled by SCB's easy credit, found themselves cut off. The once booming real estate market froze. Skeletons of luxury developments dotted the skyline, ghosts of ambition left behind. For ordinary Vietnamese citizens, it wasn't just news, it was a personal catastrophe. Thousands had lost their life savings. Pensioners were plunged into poverty. Young families who had borrowed to buy homes were left with crushing debt. Protests erupted. Citizens demanded accountability. The government promised reform, but trust once broken is not so easily mended. Years passed, the scandal faded from headlines, but its consequences endured. Regulations tightened. Banks operated under stricter scrutiny. Political leaders distanced themselves from the crisis, recasting their roles in the story as defenders of justice. But the machinery behind it all remained intact. New names rose to power. New fortunes were built. The lessons learned were not how to prevent corruption, but how to conceal it more cleverly. Because greed doesn't vanish, it evolves. The fallout from Land's empire rippled far beyond Vietnam's borders. Despite efforts to control the narrative, the truth had been exposed. The country's economic miracle had been built, at least in part, on illusion. And as the trials unfolded, the depth of her empire's reach became even more alarming. This wasn't just about a bank. Her influence stretched into energy projects, infrastructure deals, and military procurement. Leaked documents confirmed years of illicit activity, fake construction contracts, inflated budgets, and a steady stream of kickbacks routed through offshore firms. The public was forced to face a bitter truth. The prosperity they had celebrated was built on lies. Tr Kang, Mi Wai Lan, refused to speak from prison. Some believed she had cut a deal, the names of powerful collaborators, in exchange for leniency. Others said she was waiting, knowing the tides of power could turn in her favor once more. After all, she had built an empire from nothing. Who was to say she couldn't build another even from behind bars? But her former empire had splintered. SCB was dismantled, its assets absorbed by other institutions. Her vast real estate holdings were auctioned off developers eager to erase the scandal's stain. And yet, the skyline told a different story. Abandoned towers, boarded-up malls, grand visions left unfinished. Justice, for those who lost everything, came too little, too late. The government introduced compensation plans, but the process was slow, burdened by red tape. Many never saw their money again. The crash pulled down small businesses. Unemployment rose. For the first time in years, Vietnam's economic engine stalled, and abroad. Skepticism grew. Foreign banks tightened their controls. Trade partners demanded oversight. The promise of Vietnam's emerging market now came with caution labels. Still, in the quiet back rooms of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, the whispers returned of new deals, new names, and new empires being forged, because corruption doesn't die in the daylight. It simply learns how to hide better. Case 5. The aftermath of SCB and the shadow of Trang My Linh, the wake of Vietnam's largest financial scandal. The nation found itself grappling with more than just economic loss. It was facing a crisis of faith. Public outrage surged, and the government, desperate to restore a semblance of control, moved swiftly. Sweeping reforms were announced, promising transparency, tighter regulations, and a future free from corruption. But trust, once broken, is never so easily repaired. Behind the scenes, the scandal became a weapon, a tool in the hands of political factions eager to settle old debts. Accusations flew across party lines. Ministers were forced to resign, bureaucrats reassigned, and fresh faces emerged, vowing to clean house. Yet, in private rooms, far from the spotlight, the same power games continued. The players had changed, but the game remained the same. Many of those who once stood beside Trang My Linh now sought new allegiances, shifting loyalties to the next rising figure in Vietnam's turbulent political landscape. For the people on the ground, life simply moved on. In Hoi An City, once a hub of booming real estate, the skyline stall towering skeletons of half-finished buildings loomed over streets, now teeming with small businesses. Locals adapted crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending, and digital currencies emerged as grassroots alternatives to traditional banks. As faith in institutions collapsed, innovation rushed to fill the void. But in the shadows of Vietnam's financial system, whispers endured. Rumors claimed that Trang My had hidden billions in offshore accounts, money still unaccounted for. Some believed she was simply biding her time, waiting to reclaim her fortune. Others were certain her protégés had picked up where she left off, learning from her mistakes and quietly manipulating the same system that had once made her untouchable. Power, after all, is never easily relinquished. Though Mylan now officially served a life sentence, stories from behind prison walls told a different tale. The facility, some claimed, resembled a private estate more than a prison. Through intermediaries, it was said she still conducted business, still pulled strings. Her empire, though fractured, had not fallen. It had simply gone underground. The Vietnamese government poured resources into stabilizing the market, injecting capital, and enacting stricter oversight. But the damage had been done. International institutions became wary. Cross-border investments slowed. Some banks faced internal audits that exposed more cases of fraud. SCB had been the largest scandal, but it was not the only one. For ordinary citizens, the impact was devastating. Life savings vanished. Homes were lost. Businesses crumbled. Government compensation programs proved sluggish and bureaucratic, leaving thousands locked in years-long legal battles. What remained was a city and a country scarred by the unchecked greed of the elite. Politically, the scandal offered both a lesson and a weapon. The Communist Party saw internal shake-ups, old alliances shattered. New figures stepped in, some promising reform, others merely adapting to the same corrupt systems that had allowed Mylan to thrive. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of the international web that had enabled her schemes. Offshore trusts, shell corporations, hidden assets in European and Middle Eastern banks. Trang Mylan's reach had been global. Some foreign institutions quietly paid fines, keen to avoid further scrutiny. Others dug in for lengthy court battles, and then, just as the scandal began to fade from public memory, a spark reignited the fire. A respected investigative journalist received an anonymous tip of evidence that billions linked to Mylan remained hidden, offshore, untouched. The journalist began digging, ready to blow open what could be a second wave of revelations. They never got the chance. While traveling in a remote province, their vehicle veered off a road. The official report called it a tragic accident. No foul play was suspected. But those who knew the reporter were not convinced. They had been cautious, detail-oriented. The timing was too perfect, too calculated, and so, the whispers returned. If Mylan's empire had truly collapsed, why did its shadows still move in silence? Why did those who searched for the truth disappear? Because in Vietnam, as in so many places, power once seized is never given up without a fight. And in the quiet corners of its underworld, a new generation of opportunists waited, watching, ready to play the game their predecessors had mastered. Case 6. The Comex Scandal and the Rise of Sanjay Shah across Europe. A name echoed through the halls of finance and law enforcement alike. Sanjay Shah, once a medical student in London, Shah turned to finance and climbed through the ranks at institutions like Merrill Lynch and Credit Suisse. Eventually, he launched his own investment firms. But it was his role in the infamous Comex scandal that secured his place in financial infamy. The Comex scheme, exposed in 2017, was a labyrinthine trading strategy that exploited loopholes in European tax laws. At its core was a simple deception: rapid trading of shares to make it appear that multiple parties were entitled to the same dividend tax refund. Through this manipulation, Participants claimed billions in rebates on taxes they had never actually paid. Shah operated from a luxurious villa in Dubai, beyond the reach of most Western law enforcement. There, he orchestrated trades and oversaw a network of shell companies. Danish authorities accused him of masterminding a scheme that alone defrauded their country of 1.7 billion euros. Across Europe, the total losses ballooned to over 55 billion. Despite mounting charges, Shah maintained his innocence. Extradition proved difficult, tangled in international legal complexities and the absence of treaties. Meanwhile, he continued to live in opulence, untouched by the consequences of his actions. The Comex case exposed more than just a fraud. It revealed a fragile global financial infrastructure. Bankers, lawyers, and traders across continents had enabled and profited from the scheme. As trials unfolded, systemic reform became the rallying cry, but progress was slow. Shah's story remains a symbol of a new kind of criminal wealthy, mobile, and shielded by the borders of international law. A man who manipulated the rules so effectively that, even when caught, the system itself struggled to hold him accountable. From within the empire he had so meticulously built, Victor began to see cracks forming. As he plunged deeper into the underworld, he realized something chilling. The criminal ecosystem he ruled was anything but stable. Though a master of concealment, every calculated move he made gradually narrowed his exit routes. One of his boldest, most perilous decisions was stepping into the volatile world of high-stakes financial fraud, a domain where even a minor slip could trigger catastrophic consequences. It began with offshore accounts in Switzerland and Cyprus. Through a labyrinth of shell corporations, Victor funneled millions money, sourced from arms trafficking, stolen art, and sophisticated cryptocurrency scams. On paper, these companies appeared legitimate. In reality, they were polished facades, laundering dirty wealth. Victor's genius lay in his use of AI-driven algorithms that executed high-frequency trades. These systems blurred the origins of capital so effectively that even seasoned auditors couldn't trace its roots. At first, it worked flawlessly. Investors, drawn in by promises of astronomical returns, poured money into his fund unaware it was an elaborate Ponzi scheme. New investors funded payouts to earlier ones, reinforcing the illusion of success. His network stretched across the globe, from London's financial district to discreet offices tucked away in Monaco. He brokered deals with powerful figures who, like him, thrived on secrecy. But with expansion came exposure. A former associate, Hungarian banker LSCL Kovacs, began to unravel. Originally seduced by Victor's vision of limitless wealth, LSCL eventually saw the truth, the victims, the deception, the ruin. Fearing retribution and seeking salvation, LSCL approached European authorities. He offered every transaction logs, encrypted communications in exchange for immunity. Unbeknownst to Victor, a multinational task force had already been tracking him for months. LSCL's testimony was the missing puzzle piece. Soon, the dragnet closed in. Authorities surveilled Victor's every movement, intercepted his private jet itineraries, and traced digital transactions in real time. But Victor, ever the strategist, believed he was untouchable. He had bribed officials, blackmailed law enforcement, and cultivated a web of influence so vast it seemed impenetrable. But he failed to anticipate one thing: betrayal. One evening in Zurich, as he prepared to close a deal with a powerful Middle Eastern investor, chaos erupted in the lobby of his five-star hotel. Within moments, Swiss and Europol agents flooded the premises. Victor reached instinctively for one of the escape plans he'd rehearsed countless times, but there was no way out. The arrest sent shockwaves through both the financial and criminal elite. Headlines across Europe declared him the architect of one of the largest frauds in modern history. His assets were frozen. Associates were taken into custody. His empire dismantled piece by piece. And yet, as Victor sat silently in an interrogation room, staring down a lifetime behind bars. There was no trace of panic, no signs of defeat, only the faintest trace of a smirk. Because Victor knew something they didn't. His fortune wasn't completely gone, and loyalty, especially when bought with millions, was hard to erase. The interrogation room was stark and sterile, filled with the stale scent of coffee and smoke evidence of long hours spent assembling the case against him. Victor sat still, calculating at a blistering pace. Across from him sat Detective Lars Schneider's veteran Swiss investigator with ice in his veins and no tolerance for corruption. Unlike the officials Victor had bought over the years, Lars couldn't be bought. He wasn't after a payout, he wanted justice. Before Victor lay the mountain of evidence: forged documents, financial records, intercepted communications, all pointing to decades of fraud, racketeering, and international crime. Victor didn't flinch. He had faced storms before. He wouldn't let this be the moment his carefully sculpted persona fractured, but his mind couldn't help drifting back to the single miscalculation that had unraveled everything months before. Victor had orchestrated what he believed would be the crowning jewel of his career, a $2 billion operation involving stolen antiquities, illegal arms, and high-frequency market manipulation. The buyers were powerful oligarchs, rogue states, and shadow investors whose names never saw the light of day. It was a global ballet of encrypted messages, anonymous intermediaries, and impossible-to-trace fund movements. Everything had gone to plan until one email slipped through the cracks. Asterisk: the message contained no incriminating words, but embedded metadata, picked up by a French cybersecurity team, revealed a pattern. The encryption matched tools Victor had used before. It was the signal investigators had long awaited. From there, the unraveling began. Quietly, methodically. They didn't pounce. They watched, mapped the network, connected the dots. By the time they moved in, the case was ironclad. Back in the interrogation room, Lars laid it all out. Every charge, every lie, every shattered life, fraud, racketeering, money laundering, arms, trafficking. If convicted, Victor would never see the outside world again. But Victor wasn't the kind of man who simply surrendered. He leaned back in his chair, eyes unreadable. He still had cards to play. Somewhere out there, far beyond these walls, loyal operatives waited. Contingencies he'd set in motion years ago were now quietly activating. Money vast liquid, invisible, was still flowing. Victor. Andrea hadn't come this far just to fall. The only question was this truly the end, or just the beginning of the next act? Over the years, Victor had carefully built layers of protection, hidden accounts in rogue jurisdictions, encrypted, communications rigged to trigger upon his arrest, and, most importantly, people inside the system who owed him favors. But despite all his preparations, even Victor couldn't deny the truth staring him in the face. This wasn't a routine arrest. This was an international takedown, meticulously coordinated by multiple governments, an operation years in the making. His usual arsenal: bribery, coercion. Manipulation was useless here. For the first time in decades, Victor Andrea wasn't pulling the strings. He was no longer the puppet master. He was the puppet. And the thought rattled him. But surrender had never been in Victor's nature. If this was to be his final game, he would play it until the last piece fell. The heavy iron door slammed shut behind him, echoing through the dim corridor of La Santé, prison in Paris. He was no longer the untouchable power broker who had shaped the fate of nations from the shadows. Now, he was inmate number 4071, just another prisoner awaiting trial for crimes that spanned continents. The air inside was thick: sweat, mildew, hopelessness. A far cry from the penthouses and private islands Victor had once ruled from. His cell was a concrete box, bare walls, a threadbare mattress, and a rusting sink that leaked with no rhythm. No mercy. Victor ran a hand along the rough surface of the wall, his mind already calculating. He knew men like him didn't just vanish behind bars, not without consequences. His influence extended far beyond any courtroom, built on decades of secrets and mutual destruction. If he was going down, others would fall with him. And Victor had no intention of becoming a martyr. Outside the prison, the world reeled from the magnitude of his empire. The upcoming trial was shaping up to be the most explosive in European history. Media headlines painted him as a modern-day puppet master, accusing him of engineering market crashes, toppling governments, and orchestrating mass fraud from the shadows. But not everyone believed the narrative. Was Victor Andrea truly the mastermind, or merely the most convenient scapegoat for a corrupt system long in decay? His defense team worked tirelessly, but Victor knew legal strategy alone wouldn't be enough. What he needed was leverage, something to remind the powerful that he was still dangerous, that burying him came with a cost. Then, the leaks began. Anonymous data drops to journalists, encrypted dossiers sent to global intelligence agencies, files implicating world leaders, CEOs, and intelligence directors in crimes far darker than Victor's own. The public was outraged, but not at him. The outrage turned inward, toward the institutions that had once appeared untouchable. Rumors swirled, whispers of backdoor negotiations, quiet meetings, emergency calls between heads of state. Victor's knowledge was too dangerous, his network too vast. There was talk of an alternative resolution, one that didn't involve a life sentence in a concrete cage. But Victor was no fool. If a deal was to be struck, it would be on his terms, and if they planned to silence him instead, they'd have to kill him, and even then, they might fail. He sat in his cell, eyes fixed on the leaking faucet, mind churning like a machine. For the first time, the system had turned against him, but he had spent a lifetime studying weaknesses, turning other people's vulnerabilities into his greatest weapons. The leaks escalated, ministers resigned, CEOs fled into exile, intelligence services scrambled to contain the fallout. Each day brought fresh revelations, proof that Victor's empire had never acted alone. He had simply been bold enough to seize control of a system already rotten to the core. The courtroom became theater. Prosecutors called him the architect of one of the greatest financial and criminal conspiracies in history. But the defense struck back, methodically peeling apart the charges and exposing the hypocrisy of Victor's accusers. Every witness carried their own dark history, every accusation a hidden motive. Judges shifted in their seats as uncomfortable truths surfaced. Trying Victor meant exposing themselves. And Victor had not been idle behind bars. Messages had been delivered, promises made, hidden arrangements set in motion. Outside the public eye, his loyalists moved like ghosts, swift, silent, deliberate. The night before the verdict, a prison guard slipped him a note. Just 4 words. Tomorrow, we make history. Victor smiled. The game wasn't over. It never had been. As dawn rose over Paris, La Santé was unusually still. Guards moved with caution, their radios crackling with static. Surveillance feeds flickered, then cut out. Comms went down. At first, it seemed like a glitch, but those with experience in espionage knew better. In the courtroom, Victor was led to the stand, calm, stoic. The prosecutor delivered a final speech, crescendo of accusations, market manipulation, conspiracy, fraud, global corruption. Victor listened, unmoved. Then, just as the judge prepared to speak, the lights cut out darkness. A sharp explosion cracked through the silence. Shouting erupted. Guards swarmed. Victor remained seated, unshaken. In the chaos, masked figures slipped into the building, silent, precise, prepared. While the courtroom panicked, they executed their plan without hesitation. Outside, a convoy waited. Inside, the shadows moved with surgical efficiency. The man the world thought they had caged was already gone. With military precision, They bypassed every layer of security flawlessly, silently, as if the entire system had been built with this very escape in mind. In a matter of minutes, Victor Andreev was no longer in his seat. By the time order returned to the courtroom, it was already empty. The world woke up the next morning to a single encrypted message broadcast across dark channels, a message that rattled the very foundations of global security. You cannot erase what was built in the shadows. The empire lives on. Victor Andreev had vanished. That night, the streets of Paris simmered with unrest. The escape of the world's most high-profile prisoner had laid bare the fragility of institutions once thought impenetrable. Intelligence agencies scrambled. Law enforcement flooded the city. But Victor was already gone. His escape was not an act of desperation. It was a masterpiece of planning. Every move, every detail, every player in his network had been calibrated to perfection. This was no coincidence. This was leverage in motion. Victor had spent years building an empire rooted in control, not through violence or chaos, but through debt. Everyone in his orbit owed him something: their fortune, their freedom, their lives, and he never let them forget it. Those who dared betray him quickly learned. Victor didn't do forgiveness, and he never settled debts halfway. Asterisk, as the city locked down, with every airport, train station, and border under surveillance, Victor rode calmly through back alleys in an unmarked vehicle. The men who freed him, ghosts, former intelligence elites, turned mercenaries, sly and precise, and loyal not to ideals, but to debt. By sunrise, Victor Andreev had become a phantom. Global media erupted. How had the most surveilled man in modern history vanished without a trace? Theories swirled. Inside help, deep conspiracies, tech failures, but none could explain the flawless execution of what had unfolded. Governments issued emergency warrants. Entire intelligence units were reassigned, and yet no one could find him. Victor had always understood one thing: power isn't about control, it's about perception. And now, the world saw him as unstoppable. Months passed. The trail ran cold. Whispers surfaced, unconfirmed sightings in Dubai, strange banking activity in Hong Kong, a cryptic message sent to a journalist in Buenos Aires: empires don't die, they evolve. Then, everything changed again. It began subtly. A small Swiss bank collapsed overnight, its funds siphoned, its records erased. Authorities blamed cybercriminals, but those who understood the deep currents of finance knew better. Next came the fall of a European multinational. Billions vanished through an invisible maze of offshore accounts, too sophisticated even for the world's best forensic teams. Then the most chilling blow: a former intelligence chief was found dead at his estate. No signs of a break-in, number, struggle, just a single note: we settle all debts. Panic set in among the elite. Was it coincidence, paranoia, or something far more calculated? Victor had returned, and this wasn't vengeance, it was strategy. Across the world, another name haunted the pages of criminal history: Lu Chang, a man whose empire was born not in bloodshed, but in shadows. Born in 1972 in Guangzhou, Lu came from modest beginnings. His father worked in a factory. His mother sold dim sum on street corners. But Lu was never content with the life set before him. While others pursued education or factory jobs, he sought power, real power. By 17, he was already moving contraband along China's southern coast. But Lu wasn't like the other street-level smugglers. He had a gift-on uncanny mind for logistics, deception, and long-term planning. He climbed the ranks fast. During China's economic boom of the 1990s, while the world celebrated prosperity, Lu saw opportunity in its blind spots. He broke away from his crew and built his own network and empire that stretched across provinces. Counterfeit goods, weapons, stolen electronics, human trafficking. Lu had a stake in it all. But his most profitable and deadly venture was counterfeit pharmaceuticals. Lu set up secret factories, He paid workers to keep silent, bribed regulators to look away. His fake medications flowed into pharmacies across Asia and beyond. They looked legitimate, but they were time bombs. In 2008, authorities intercepted a batch of fake antibiotics in Hong Kong. It led them to one of Lu's factories in Shenzhen. What followed was the slow unraveling of an empire so vast, even seasoned, investigators were stunned. For years, Lu remained untouchable. He operated through shell companies and offshore accounts. He changed identities like clothing. He was everywhere and nowhere, all at once. When Chinese authorities launched their largest crackdown on organized crime in 2012, Lu was already gone hidden somewhere in Southeast Asia, still pulling strings from the shadows. But betrayal brought him down. One of his most trusted lieutenants, fearing for his life, flipped with intelligence from the defector. Chinese authorities and Interpol coordinated an international raid. Lu was found in a luxury villa in Bangkok, living like royalty. He was extradited to China. His trial became one of the most high-profile events in Chinese legal history. The courtroom was packed. Victims' families wept. Journalists fought for front-row seats. The evidence? Devastating financial trails, testimonies, records of death and ruin. Lu Chang's empire collapsed. But the scars it left behind, silent tragedies, the broken families, the lives lost to counterfeit hope would remain etched in history. The fall and rise of Lu Chang, mountains of confiscated goods, sealed vaults, and shuttered factories told the tale of an empire in ruins. There was no escape now. The verdict came swiftly, and the punishment was harsh. Lu Chang's empire crumbled. His wealth was seized, his influence dismantled, and his name turned into a warning, a reminder that no matter how powerful a criminal becomes, the law always catches up. But for his victims, justice came too late. The damage had already been done. Lives were lost, families devastated. No sentence could undo what Lu's counterfeit pharmaceuticals had caused: slow, painful deaths for those who unknowingly consumed his poison in search of healing. And so, Lu Chang's name faded into infamy, remembered not for his cunning, brilliance, but for the devastation he left behind. Inside his prison cell, Lu sat in silence, staring at the cold gray walls that had replaced his opulent villas and boardrooms. Once the undisputed kingpin of China's criminal underworld, he was now reduced to just another inmate, stripped of power, fortune, and freedom. Yet his story was far from over. The fall of Lu's empire sent shockwaves through the criminal world. For decades, he had operated with near total impunity, amassing billions through a vast web of corruption and deceit. His counterfeit drug syndicates spanned continents, and while people died from his fake medications, Lu lived in obscene luxury, untouched, and above the law. The trial may have ended quickly, but the investigation into his global operations was just beginning. Authorities unearthed thousands of bank statements, encrypted communications, and shadow transactions. Hidden warehouses, filled with counterfeit drugs, were discovered. Offshore accounts traced billions flowing through secretive channels, and one by one, the corrupt officials who had shielded Lu were dragged into the light. Inside his cell, Lu watched his empire unravel. Allies began turning against him, striking deals for leniency. Men who once toasted his name now testified against him, revealing the very secrets he'd buried under layers of bribes and fear. The network he had built, once thought impenetrable, was collapsing from within. Outside, the Chinese government launched its most aggressive anti-corruption drive in decades. Using Lu's downfall as a warning, they cracked down hard. Once untouchable officials were now facing trials. The underworld Lu had ruled with an iron grip was in disarray, rival factions scrambling to claim the scraps of his legacy. Still, Lu refused to believe this was the end. He had built his empire from nothing, outsmarted police, prosecutors, and politicians alike. He had escaped impossible situations before. Prison, to him, was just another system, one with its own rules, flaws, and currency, he observed. Weighted, calculated. Every guard had habits. Some had secrets, affairs, addictions, gambling debts. Weaknesses Lu could exploit. He began planting seeds, coded notes, whispers in the dark, promises of riches. The first bribe went unnoticed, then another, and another. Old enforcers, once powerful and now imprisoned alongside him, still respected him, still feared him. They fell in line. Quietly, a network formed behind bars. Outside, the world hadn't forgotten Lu Chang. Some loyalists had fled abroad, preserving fragments of his fractured empire. They waited, watching. Ready. Then came the moment. A transfer order. Lu was to be moved to a higher security facility, a fortress meant to erase him from the world. But the system made one fatal mistake. The guard overseeing the transfer had already been compromised. Drowning in gambling debt, he was desperate and bought. The escape was precise. On the night of the transfer, a fake security alert forced the convoy to reroute. At a deserted intersection, a duplicate vehicle awaited. The real guards were neutralized in seconds. Lu was gone before anyone even realized what had happened. By the time the prison sounded the alarm, Lu Chang was already in the sky, aboard a private jet, headed to a country with no extradition treaty. The world erupted. Chinese officials ordered a global manhunt. Interpol was activated. News headlines around the world blared the impossible. China's most notorious criminal escapes from high-security transfer. How? Who helped him? How deep did the corruption still go? But Lu Chang once again was untouchable. From a luxurious villa in a coastal nation, far beyond China's reach, he watched the sun set over the ocean. A glass of wine in hand, calm and unshaken. His empire had fallen, his fortune seized, but he was still alive, and as long as he lived, he could rebuild. He had done it once. He would do it again. He was a ghost now, a shadow cast across the world, from a hidden corner where law could no longer reach. The empire had fallen. The victims had been buried. The headlines had faded. But Lu Chang had vanished, not broken, only waiting. Some say justice was never truly served, that a man responsible for so much death and corruption should never have walked free. Others say his escape was inevitable, a final act in a life built on outsmarting the system. But one thing is certain: as long as Lu Chang draws breath, the story isn't over. It's only paused, and somewhere out there, in the shadows, the architect of China's most powerful criminal empire is already writing his next chapter. Because men like Lu Chang don't disappear. They rebuild. They return.